It was not yet determined how punishment should be meted out to the remainder, but circumstances themselves decided the matter. Wurs became tired of guarding so large a number as Key had arrested, and he informed Key that he should turn them back into the stockade immediately. Key begged for a little farther time to consider the disposition of the cases, but Wurs refused it, and ordered the officer of the guard to return all arrested, save those sentenced to death, to the stockade. In the meantime, the news had spread through the prison that the raiders were to be sent in again unpunished, and an angry mob, numbering some thousands, and mostly composed of men who had suffered injuries at the hands of the marauders, gathered at the south gate, clubs in hand, to get such satisfaction as they could out of the rascals. They formed in two long parallel lines, facing inward, and grimly awaited the incoming of the objects of their vengeance. The officer of the guard opened the wicket in the gate and began forcing the raiders through it, one at a time, at the point of the bayonet, and each as he entered was told that he already realized well that he must run for his life. They did this with all the energy that they possessed, and as they ran, blows rained on their heads, arms, and backs. If they could succeed in breaking through the line at any place, they were generally let go without any further punishment. 3 of the number were beaten to death. I saw one of these killed. I had no liking for the gauntlet performance and refused to have anything to do with it, as did most, if not all, of my crowd. While the gauntlet was in operation, I was standing by my tent at the head of a little street about 200 feet from the line, watching what was being done. A sailor was let in. He had a large bowie knife concealed about his person somewhere, which he drew and struck savagely with at his tormentors on either side. They fell back from before him, but closed in behind and pounded him terribly. He broke through the line and ran up the street towards me. About midway at the distance stood a boy who had helped carry a dead man out during the day, and while out had secured a large pine rail which he had brought in with him. He was holding this straight up in the air as if at a present arms. He seemed to have known from the first that the raider would run that way. Just as he came squarely under it, the boy dropped the rail like the bar of a toll gate. It struck the raider across the head, felled him as if by a shot, and his pursuers then beat him to death. He and those immediately about him kept his own counsel in the matter, and suffered no secret of their intentions to leak out until on the morning of the 11th, when it became generally known that the sentences were to be carried into effect that day and inside the prison. My first direct information as to this was by a messenger from Key with an order to assemble my company and stand guard over the carpenters who were to erect the scaffold. He informed me that all the regulators would be held in readiness to come to our relief if we were attacked in force. I had hoped that if the men were to be hanged, I would be spared the unpleasant duty of assisting, for, though I believed that they richly deserved that punishment, I had much rather someone else administered it upon them. There was no way out of it, however, that I could see, and so Egypt and I got the boys together and marched down to the designated place, which was an open space near the end of the street running from the south gate, and kept vacant for the purpose of issuing rations. It was quite near the spot where the raiders' big tent had stood, and afforded as good a view to the rest of the camp as could be found. He had secured the loan of a few beams and rough planks sufficient to build a rude scaffold with. Our first duty was to care for these as they came in, for such was the need of wood and plank for tent purposes that they would scarcely have fallen to the ground before they were spirited away, had we not stood over them all the time with clubs. The carpenters sent by Key came over and set to work. The New Yorkers gathered around in considerable numbers, sullen and abusive. They cursed us with all their rich vocabulary of foul epithets, vowed that we should never carry out the execution, and swore that they had marked each one for vengeance. We returned the compliments in kind, and occasionally it seemed as if a general collision was imminent, but we succeeded in avoiding this, and by noon the scaffold was finished. As the arrangements neared completion, the excitement in and around the prison grew intense. Key came over with the balance of the regulators, and we formed a hollow square around the scaffold, our company marking the line on the east side. There were now 30,000 in the prison. Of these, about one-third packed themselves as tightly about our square as they could stand. The remaining 20,000 were wedged together in a solid mass on the north side. Again I contemplated the wonderful, startling spectacle of a mosaic pavement of human faces covering the whole broad hillside. It did hurt. The day was broiling hot. The sun shot his perpendicular rays down the blistering fierceness, and the densely packed, motionless crowds made the heat almost insupportable. He took up his position inside the square to direct matters. With him were Limper Jim, Dick McCullough, and one or two others. Also Ned Johnson, Tom Larkin, Sergeant Goody, and three others who were to act as hangmen. Each of these six was provided with a white sack, such as the rebels brought meal in. Two corporals of my company, Stagg Harris and Watt Payne, were appointed to pull the stays from under the platform at the signal. A little after noon, the south gate opened, and Wurs rode in, dressed in a suit of white duck, and mounted on his white horse, a conjunction which had gained for him the appellation of Death on a Pale Horse. Behind him walked the faithful old priest, wearing his church's purple insignia of the deepest sorrow, and reading the service for the condemned. The 6 doomed men followed, walking between double ranks of rebel guards. All came inside the hollow square and halted. Wurs then said, "Prisoners, I return to you those men so boot as I got 'em. You have tried them yourselves and found them guilty. I have had nothing to do with it. I wash my hands of everything connected with them. Do with them as you like, and may God have mercy on you and on them. Guards, about face, forwards, march."
Prisoners, I return these men to you as good as I got them. You have tried them yourselves and found them guilty. I have had nothing to do with it. Do with them as you like, and may God have mercy on you and on them. Company! About! Face! Forward! March!
After Wirtz made his speech, he withdrew his guards, leaving the condemned at the mercy of 28,000 enraged prisoners.
The whole camp had been as still as death since Wurz's exit. For a moment, the condemned looked stunned. They seemed to comprehend for the first time that it was really the determination of the regulars to hang them. Before that, they had evidently thought that the talk of hanging was merely bluff. One of them gasped out, "My God, men, you don't really mean to hang us up there?" He answered grimly and laconically, "That seems to be about the size of it."
My God, you don't mean to really hang us up there? That's about the size of it.
Curtis turned from the crowd with desperation convulsing his features. Tearing off the broad-brimmed hat which he wore, he flung it on the ground with the exclamation, "By God, I'll die this way first!" And drawing his head down and folding his arms about it, he dashed forward for the center of my company like a great stone hurled from a catapult. Egypt and I saw where he was going to strike, and ran down the line to help stop him. As he came up, he rained blows on his head with our clubs, but so many of us struck at him at once that we broke each other's clubs to pieces and only knocked him on his knees. He rose with an almost superhuman effort and plunged into the mass beyond. The excitement almost became delirium. For an instant I feared that everything was gone to ruin. Egypt and I strained every energy to restore our lines before the break could be taken advantage of by the others. Our boys behaved splendidly, standing firm, and in a few seconds the line was restored. As Curtis broke through, Delaney, a brawny Irishman standing next to him, started to follow. He took one step. At the same instant, Limber Jim's long legs took 3 great strides and placed him directly in front of Delaney. Jim's right hand held an enormous bowie knife, and as he raised it above Delaney, he hissed out, "If you dare move another step, I'll open you from one end to the other." Delaney stopped. This checked the others till our lines reformed.
This is nothing. Keep your peckers up, boys. We'll have no weakness here. What? Did you think you were going to live forever?
This was going on. Two of my company, belonging to the 5th Iowa Cavalry, were in hot pursuit of Curtis. I had seen them start and shouted to them to come back, as I feared they would be set upon by the raiders and murdered. But the din was so overpowering that they could not hear me, and doubtless would not have come back if they had heard. Curtis ran diagonally down the hill, jumping over the tents and knocking down the men who happened in his way.
It was yelled out that he had a knife in his hand, and so a path was made for him.
Arriving at the swamp, he plunged in, sinking nearly to his hips in the fetid, filthy ooze. He forged his way through with terrible effort. His pursuers followed his example and caught up to him just as he emerged on the other side. They struck him on the back of the head with their clubs and knocked him down. By this time, order had been restored about us. The guns remained silent, and the crowd massed around us again. From where we were, we could see the successful end of the chase after Curtis, and we could see his captors start back with him. Their success was announced with a roar of applause from the north side. Both captors and captured were greatly exhausted, and they were coming back very slowly. Key ordered the balance up onto the scaffold. They obeyed promptly. The priest resumed his reading of the service for the condemned. The excitement seemed to make the doomed ones exceedingly thirsty. I never saw men drink such inordinate quantities of water. They called for it continually, gulped down a quart or more at a time, and kept two men going nearly all the time, carrying it to them. When Curtis finally arrived, he sat on the ground for a minute or so to rest, and then, reeking with filth, slowly and painfully climbed the steps. Delaney seemed to think he was suffering as much from fright as anything else, and said to him, "Come on up now. Show yourself a man and die game."
All were given a chance to talk. Munn, a good-looking fellow in marine dress, said he came into the prison 4 months before, perfectly honest and as innocent of crime as any fellow in it. Starvation, with evil companions, had made him what he was. He spoke of his mother and sisters in New York, that he cared nothing as far as he himself was concerned, but the news that would be carried home to his people made him want to curse God he had ever been born. Curtis said he didn't care a blank, only hurry up and not be talking about it all day, making too much fuss over a very small matter. William Collins, alias Mosby, said he was innocent of murder and ought not to be hung. He had stolen blankets and rations to preserve his own life, and begged the crowd not to see him hung, as he had a wife and child at home, and for their sake to let him live. The excited crowd began to be impatient for the show to commence, as they termed it. Sarsfield made quite a speech. He had studied for a lawyer. At the outbreak of the rebellion he had enlisted and served 3 years in the army, been wounded in battle, furloughed home, wound healed up, promoted to first sergeant, and also commissioned. His commission as a lieutenant had arrived, but had not been mustered in when he was taken prisoner. Began by stealing parts of rations, gradually becoming hardened as he became familiar with the crimes practiced. Evil associates had helped him to go downhill, and here he was. The other did not care to say anything.
He pulled a watch from his pocket and said, 2 minutes more to talk. Delaney said cheerfully, well, goodbye, byes. If I've hurted any of yous, I hope you'll forgive me. Spake up now, are any of yous that I've hurted, and say you'll forgive me. We called upon Marion Friend, whose throat Delaney had tried to cut 3 weeks before while robbing him of $40, to come forward. In spite of our company and our watchfulness, the raiders beat us badly on one occasion. Marion Friend of Company I of our battalion was one of the smaller traders and had accumulated $40 by his bartering. One evening at dusk, Delaney's raiders, about 25 strong, took advantage of the absence of most of us drawing rations to make a rush for Marion. They knocked him down, cut him across the wrist and neck with a razor, and robbed him of his $40. But Friend was not in a forgiving mood and refused with an oath.
This is nothing, boys. Doesn't matter a damn. Doesn't matter at all. Let's get this done right. Jim.
Don't you worry about that.
He said, time's up, put the watch back in his pocket, and raised his hand like an officer commanding a gun. The priest began praying aloud. Key dropped his hand. Payne and Harris snatched the supports out with a single jerk. The planks fell with a clatter. 5 of the bodies swung around dizzily in the air. The 6th, that of Mosby, a large, powerful, raw-boned man, one of the worst in the lot, and who, among other crimes, had killed Limber Jim's brother, broke the rope and fell with a thud to the ground,
with blood spurting from his ears, mouth, and nose.
Some of the men ran forward, examined the body, and decided that he still lived. The rope was cut off his neck, the meal sack removed, and water thrown in his face until consciousness returned. At the first instant, he thought he was in eternity. He gasped out, "Where am I? Am I in another world?" Limber Jim muttered that they would soon show him where he was, and went on grimly fixing up the scaffold anew. Mosby soon realized what had happened.
As they lifted him back to the swinging off place, he revived and begged for his life.
"Oh, for God's sake, do not put me up there again. God has spared my life once. He meant that you should be merciful to me." Limber Jim deigned him no reply. When the scaffold was rearranged and a stout rope had replaced the broken one, he pulled the meal sack once more over Mosby's head, who never ceased his pleadings. Then, picking up the large man as if he were a baby, he carried him to the scaffold and handed him up to Tom Larkin, who fitted the noose around his neck and sprang down. The supports had not been set with the same delicacy as at first, and Limber Jim had to set his heel and wrench desperately at them before he could force them out. Then Mosby passed away without a struggle.
Munn died easily, as also did Delaney. All the rest died hard, and particularly Sarsfield, who drew his knees nearly to his chin and then straightened them out with a jerk, the veins on his neck swelling out as if they would burst. It was an awful sight to see, still a necessity.
After hanging till life was extinct, the bodies were cut down, the meal sacks pulled off their faces, and the regulators formed 2 parallel lines through which all the prisoners passed and took a look at the bodies. Pete Donnelly and Dick Allen knelt down and wiped the froth off Delaney's lips and swore vengeance against those who had done him to death.